Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk here today. I rather grandly called this Mastering the TOGAF Standard. And I guess I'm delivering this not just from the perspective of the job I have today. I'm very lucky to be the product manager for the TOGAF Standard at the Open Group, but from really more deeply from my perspective, I guess, as someone who's worked as an architect for a long time. So prior to joining the Open Group, I worked as an enterprise architect in lots of places for lots of years. Very often referring to the TOGAF standard and using it, and sometimes not. I think, like a lot of people who use the TOGAF standard, went on something of a journey. And who knew? Who knew that one day I would be the person responsible for the product? I would have laughed at you at the very idea if you'd have told me that back in something like 2002 or something, when I was scratching my head looking at it, trying to make sense out of it all. And so I guess what I would hope that I'm going to be able to do today is give you a few pointers. But before I get into that, a little bit about the Open Group. The Open Group, it's interesting. I never know how many people have really heard of the Open Group. Very often I suspect it's fewer people than have heard of the TOGAF standard in some ways. But the Open Group is much more than the TOGAF standard. I guess it started out back in the day as a home for the Unix standard, the Unix specification, which is also coincidentally where I cut my teeth as a thrusting young systems engineer back in the early 90s. But also a lot of other standards that might be of interest to people on this call. Archimate, for example, and IT for IT, very closely associated, I think, with the same subject matter that the TOGAF standard looks at, to name a couple. And as an organization, I find myself correcting people sometimes, especially in my job now. The Open Group doesn't write the TOGAF standard or any of the standards that it looks after. These things are written by members of the Open Group, who are people from organizations just like yourselves. And really, if I had to try and sum up the Open Group in a nutshell, I guess it would be that it's an organization that facilitates the creation of standards by people who do work. And I think that makes a big difference in terms of how people ought to be looking and considering the contents of the standard. The TOGAF standard isn't a product that's created by the Open Group, and we march out into the world and encourage people to adopt our product because our product is the best. The TOGAF standard is the product of collaboration between many practicing architects who are attempting to share the experience that they have built up through doing work. So it's not a theoretical kind of here's what might work and here's what, let's try this. It really is a distillation of the experience of many people working over many years. And as such, it's quite humbling to be kind of a custodian for it for a time. And when you look at the TOGAF standard, I think it's very important that you bear that in mind. It's not a textbook. It's not a thesis. It's not even written by one person. If you've read it and you've gone, well, how come this bit is in a completely different voice and a completely different style to this bit? It's because it's written by a lot of people over many years. And as such, that character, which could be considered to be, perhaps if you didn't know that coming into it, a bit jarring, is really representative of the many personalities that have contributed to it over the years, too numerous to mention, but all of whom deserve the credit for it. Anyway, that's enough about that. Just bear that in mind. So What am I going to try and cover in this session? I've got, a limited amount of time to tell you stuff. I laugh. I somewhat optimistically put 30 minutes on this slide. I suspect even if this was time boxed at 30 minutes, I'd take longer than that to talk through it. Why is that? Because I'm an architect, and obviously I can talk for to fill up the available space. Um, in that 30 minutes, obviously I'm not going to turn you into Jedi masters of the TOGAF standard. But I can give you some pointers which I hope will help you navigate the journey that you're on, wherever you are in that journey. So we're going to run down these bullet points. I'm not going to read them all out. You've probably been browsing over them for yourself while I've been talking. But I am going to do my best to give you some pointers and I guess set you up with the right frame of mind for using the TOGAF standard. We'll see how we go. There should be time at the end for questions. So if questions occur to you as you go through, jot them down, fire them in, and we can have a chat at the end. In the meantime, I'm going to do my best to guess what you might want to know over the next 30 minutes or so. So, the first thing, why are standards helpful at all? Well, I threw some things on this slide, but what am I really getting at? I think if I look back over the last couple of decades, the thing that I found to be the most difficult when dealing with architecture is getting two architects to agree on something. You all have heard the jokes before about that. And why is that? Well, I think a lot of it comes from a basic difficulty to communicate what ought to be simple concepts with simple language. One person's component is another person's object. One person's building block is another person's component. That kind of conversation. One person's domain is another person's business unit. One person's domain is another person's segment of an architecture. What does all that mean? And without a common frame of reference, it's really difficult to have even the most basic of conversations amongst architects, never mind amongst the people, in the real world, the muggles. I'll come back to that in a minute. But getting two architects to have a meaningful conversation about the things that are actually important rather than an argument about semantics can be very difficult, especially if those two architects are separated by geography, organization, nationality, language, culture, all of those other things that get in the way that complicate or make it difficult to find a common frame of reference into just for conversation. I think is a real issue, and still is amongst many people. I've worked with people who sit at the same desk as me in the same organization, working on the same stuff, and had that problem in the past. And I dare say, if I was in an office today, I would still be having that problem. It'd be interesting to know, actually, whether or not the people, whether you guys listening feel that's still an issue for you where you are. So where standards, I think, really help is in speeding up or greasing the wheels of those conversations to get all of the nonsense out of the way around finding that common frame of reference so that meaningful conversations can happen. That is, I think, a really significant thing with enterprise architecture standards. If you think about it, it shouldn't really be that much of a surprise. The discipline is still relatively young. The whole business of large organizations, and the idea of an enterprise is still a relatively young thing. It's still relatively new. The computer industry from which the enterprise architecture really has been born is still relatively young when compared to more established professions, especially if you try and compare it to actual architecture buildings. and the like. So the fact that it doesn't have a universally acknowledged and accepted uh, language around it isn't that much of a surprise if we consider it in the context of the full kind of range of human endeavor. But it's still annoying when you encounter it. Now, that's not obviously it's not the only thing that enterprise architecture standards are good for. There is a whole store of experience that manifests as guidance, manifests as good practice, things that you should do, things that you should consider. I mean, that's almost a given. A standard without, a body of knowledge associated with it that tells you what, or gives you insight into what you should be doing and how you should be doing it. That's a bit obvious, but I think it's that ability to communicate cleanly and efficiently, which is the thing that contributes really to successful adoption. So on a simple level, I'd really be stressing the idea that if you have a group of people who all have a basic understanding of the same terms, the same modes of practice, the same ideas about what you should do, how you should do it, what you should make, the furniture of enterprise architecture. If you share that language, you're going to find that you spend less time arguing about what a component is, or what a building block is, or what a business unit is, and more time focusing on how to solve the problems that are in front of you. And time is money, which is why at the top of any of these kinds of ideas, you get the idea of cost savings. You have to throw that in, really, don't you, for the project managers? But that's really, that is what I would say is the biggest help that you get when looking at enterprise architecture standards. If you couldn't tell, I could probably talk about that all day, but I'll resist the temptation. So let's get down to having an overview of the TOGAF standard. It can be, when you encounter it, a baffling and bewildering body of work. And the reason for that is there's a lot in it, and it's not really feasible to expect people to read it from front to back and absorb it all. But what you really need to do is know how to navigate your way around it. And how to find the bits that are really going to be useful to you at a point in time, in context. Unless you're doing the certification, in which case just go on a training course and eat the standard for a few days, and really get to grips with it. And there are any number of courses that will take you through that. But if you're not at the point yet where you're ready for that, or you want to do that, or you just want to dip into the TOGAF standard and you want to know where to start, the first thing to know is, well, what are the bits of it? What's it made up of? Now, if you look at that graphic on the left, what you see is, classically a set of boxes in boxes. But you've got the Open Group Library, which is the place where all the material is stored. And you'll find that if you go visit opengroup.org, click your mouse around the screen a little bit, you're going to find the TOGAF library. It's very easy to find. I haven't put an address there, but honestly, I have every confidence that you're going to be able to track it down. Now, within the TOGAF library, you've got a whole bunch of peripheral things around there. Don't worry about those for now. Just look at the thing that says the TOGAF standard and understand that it's made up of two primary sets of knowledge, sets of work, publications, if you will. We have the TOGAF fundamental content, and that's the stuff really that defines, I guess, what I would call the meat and potatoes of the TOGAF standard. You'll find the vocabulary defined there. You'll find a definition of the associated architecture development method. You'll find all of the core material about governance. That's where all of the kind of well, clues in the name, where all the fundamentals are. And then you've got this other block here called TOGAF Series Guides, and that's a whole bunch of material that tells you really, well, it doesn't tell you, that's the wrong word on reflection. a whole bunch of series guides that show you how the fundamentals can be applied to a specific context. For the most part, we've got a few outlying series guides that don't show you how to do that. They show you something else, but don't worry about that for now. Just on a simple level, just take it from me that the TOGAF series guides are really explainers that show how to apply the fundamental content in a given context. Sometimes they add extra bits to the fundamental content, but they should explain why. And sometimes they vary from the fundamental content. At times they'll say there's some stuff in the fundamental content that doesn't apply in this context, in which case do this instead. And to a cold reader, that can sound a bit perplexing. That can be like, well, this part of the standard tells me to do this, and this part of the standard tells me not to. And the reason for that is because the TOGAF standard is deliberately a flexible framework. It's intended that when you adopt it and when you apply it in practice, that you make thoughtful and intelligent decisions on what you need to do from the material that it offers. And your answer sometimes might be none of it. That's fine. As long as you've got a plan for tackling the problems that are in front of you. Now, one thing that the TOGAF standard is quite good at, especially in the context of enterprise architecture, is because it's based on the experience of so many people in so many different fields of work over so many years. It's pretty good at helping you understand what you don't know, or helping you to remember to do things that you didn't even know you needed to do. Now, if you've got a completely different way of tackling the fundamental problems that the fundamental content is designed to solve, great, good luck to you. And that's fine. But what you'll find, I think, is that the way that the TOGAF standard structures itself and outlines the range of things that you ought to be doing in response to a given problem are so fundamental and so straightforward when laid out that a lot of the content is very hard to argue with. I think that, a lot of people have problems with the TOGAF standard and talk about it being kind of, no good for them or too rigid. And I think many people really miss the point, in as much as you're not really supposed to do it all every time. I'll come on to that a bit more in the next slides. Because before I get into explaining what I just said, it's probably worth understanding a little bit more about what it actually does say. At the heart of the TOGAF standard, you've got this thing called the architecture development method. You can see that in the context of the fundamental content, 3/5 of the volumes are dedicated to explaining the architecture development method. You've got a section on on architecture content, which really is looking at explaining the meta models that sit behind it, the structure, the concepts of enterprise architecture. And you've got a chunk on EA capability and governance, which is really guidance to help you set up and run an architecture capability and govern enterprise architecture in motion, in play. And what I'm not going to do today is delve into exactly what all of those things say, because that's just way outside the scope. It's enough for you to know that it's got this content in it, I think, for today within the constraints of the time we've got. And it's enough for you to know that the architecture development method is important, but I'm going to kind of demystify it in a moment. And it's enough for you to know that, of course, the TOGAF standard recognizes that enterprise architecture governance is really important. It's a controversial topic with many people, this idea of governance, but really, the key to governance, I think, it's all in the it's all in the way that it's performed. The reason I say that is a lot of people get kind of quite nervous about the whole topic of governance because it sounds so rigid, so much like there's like almost like a command and control culture associated with the word governance. Really, the way that the style in which you perform governance is entirely up to you. The TOGAF standard doesn't assert that enterprise architecture is the root of all knowledge, and enterprise architects rule the world, and everybody's job is to do whatever an enterprise architect tells them. That is nonsense. What it does tell you, though, is when you're doing governance, in whatever style you consider to be appropriate, there are a key set of concerns that really need to be considered, and there's a fairly straightforward way of making sure that they're properly identified and managed. So let's talk a little bit more about the architecture development method, or even let's talk a little bit more about TOGAF Series Guides. TOGAF Series Guides. I mentioned already that I called them, I guess, explainers, or they're intended really to show you how to use the TOGAF standard in a given context. And at times they will appear to disagree with the fundamental content. At times they'll appear to vary from what it says in the fundamental content in one way or another. And those are all manifestations of this idea that the TOGAF standard is flexible and tailorable. The important thing really to bear in mind about those TOGAF series guides is that they are written from the perspective of things that people have actually done in their actual work. And again, like the sort of the material in the fundamental content, they're not written from a theoretical perspective. They're written from a perspective of what worked for people in their organization. And new TOGAF series guides are being published all the time. I've listed a whole bunch of topics on the right there, but each topic can have more than one series guide associated with it. And so if what you want from the TOGAF standard is more specificity, not specificity, that's the right. If you want more specific, kind of relatable examples of how to cope as an enterprise architect in a given situation, that's where the series guides are going to really help you. And so they're building on the fundamental content. There is some variation from the fundamental content, but that variation is very much in the spirit of the sort of tailorable nature of the TOGAF standard. So here's where I thought we were going next. I forgot about that other slide. So having done a quick survey of kind of the basic anatomy of the TOGAF standard, how should you go about picking it up? Well, there's a little recipe here, and I've lifted it straight out of the TOGAF standard itself. I talked about this thing called the ADM, and part of the ADM is this thing called the preliminary phase, which is basically getting started. In fact, I sometimes think if the TOGAF standard were written from scratch today, that preliminary phrase might actually be called getting started, because it's a lot easier to say than preliminary, which I continually have trouble with. So this little recipe book, when you look down the things that it says here, it's difficult to find anything in here to argue with. To get started, you've really got to take a look at where you are and who's around you, and what the scope of your problem space is. You've got to find out what the organization is already doing that impacts the way that enterprise architecture is going to be performed. The answer to that might be nothing. The answer to that might be loads of things. And your job really is to figure out which of those things are working and which aren't, and fill the gaps. There's other stuff in here, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, concept of getting architecture principles together and all that kind of other stuff. I'm not here to teach you how to be an architect. I'm kind of hoping you've already got some. But this item number 5, tailoring the TOGAF framework, That's the bit that I really, I guess, wanted to emphasize today. Um, I mentioned earlier that, it's no one expects us to do all of the TOGAF framework every time. No one expects you to do everything all of the time, right? Um, but I don't know what it is, because I've done exactly the same thing when I was younger. You bump into something called a method or a process, and well, okay, I'm going to stop saying you because that's not fair. I don't know who you are. When I when I was younger, he said, with great self-awareness, um, I bumped into things called methods and processes and just expect them to be cookbooks to follow. And I thought, well, I can do this. I can start here and finish there. And if I do everything in between, I'll have done everything that I'm supposed to do, and good things will happen. So, crack on. And I did that with a lot of things. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. But very often it resulted in me doing a lot more work than I needed to, because I didn't exercise sufficient wit and wisdom to not do the things that weren't helpful. By people that I've worked with over the years have heard me say this a lot of times. Um, this thing here says I've got to do this, but I don't see the point, and it's really not going to help. To which my answer was, well, don't do it then. Why would you do that if it's going to provide no value? And the same is true with TOGAF Standard. You've really got to pick the things, make thoughtful choices about the things that you need to do in your job, and find analogies to that in the TOGAF Standard, which will help you do that task, perform that task, and achieve your goals and objectives more efficiently than, say, just guessing what it is that you need to do. And so, although this thing is called the ADM and this thing is called the TOGAF Standard, my advice to you is to think of it more as a reference manual. I need to do this. Where in the TOGAF Standard is the thing that's going to help me do that? Now, the thing that you might need to do might be quite discrete, might be quite contained, or it might be something massive like, transforming a multinational organization. Is that you size, you perform the elements of the TOGAF standard that are going to help you achieve that goal. You don't just mindlessly start in phase A and march around to phase H, occasionally checking in with the requirements blob in the middle because that's what it looks like you're supposed to do. So you're not supposed to do that. So please don't do that. Now, when you come to try and understand the architecture development method, it is helpful to know where to find or where to look for the information that might help you. And that's the sort of thing that training and certification can offer you. It can help you survey the entirety of the TOGAF standard and understand where all the things are, where all the content is, basically where to go look for the stuff that might help you. And really I think a good way of thinking about these phases is you've probably all seen this crop circle diagram before somewhere or other, and wondered what it meant. I think of them as filing cabinets. That this is where the content on this subject is. If you want to understand what the TOGAF standard has got to say about business architecture, look in the business architecture filing cabinet. If you want to know what it's got to say about setting up or getting started, look in the preliminary phase, which I still can't say. But don't think of them as like phase A. All right, I'll start there. I'll check in a bit with preliminary. Don't understand why it hasn't got a phase letter, but never mind. It's at the top of the stack, so I better go and have a look in there before I do phase A. But I'll do phase A, and then I'll do B, C, D, E, F, G, and H, and then I should be done. That's not how it works at all. So you might be asking, well, why have they all got lines in between them, and why have they got letters? Well, why have they got letters? I don't know. It's just because they do. Don't worry about it. It's not important. I think they've got letters because it's a shorthand for the words. That's my best guess. There's probably some real rational reason behind all of that, but it's been lost in the midst of time as far as I'm concerned. And I've not bothered to go and find out why, because it doesn't matter. I don't care. It just does. Relax. Doesn't matter. Um, why has it got the names that they've got? Well, it's because the names are pretty good descriptions of the contents. It's back to that filing cabinet idea. Why are there lines between them? Well, because I think because it's really indicating, if anything, dependencies. Okay, the information systems architecture depends on the business architecture. Um, there's a relationship between them. Is the best explanation I can manage. It makes sense to me. That's how I think of it. Um, I think the real reason probably is that, an arrangement of circles like that, with a circle in the middle, is really begging for lines to connect them up to make it look nice. And I suspect deep down that is probably the real reason why there's lines. Why are there arrows? Again, I think once upon a time, the arrows were indicating relationships. Business architecture begets information systems architecture. Technology architecture begets opportunities and solutions. Those arrows have been removed in 10th edition because they were felt to be confusing. Interestingly, the arrows in the middle weren't removed. And that has prompted requests to remove them since. And so we might see that in a future edition. What that's telling it, or a future revision, I should say, what that's telling you, though, is I really don't think the arrows mean anything either. So don't get hung up about them. The fact that there are lines and arrows doesn't matter. I think what's really important is that each of those circles on that diagram represents a collection of content that is going to help you deal with the problem space that's between them. And really, if you're agonizing or getting annoyed about what the arrows mean and what the lines mean and why they're there, you're thinking about the wrong things. You've lost your way. These are not the things to be worried about. What you really should be worried about are the things that are inside those circles, the problems that they are implying, and the techniques and practices that it suggests to solve them. Now, once you get into that, the content is really straightforward. In fact, basic, business architecture, information systems architecture, and technology architecture, phases C, B, C, and D. The techniques to identify and resolve those problem spaces are more or less identical. Hopefully, I'm not sitting too far away from the microphone. I've got ever so relaxed and I've sat miles away from the screen. How am I doing for the time? 22. I need to pick it up a bit. Anyway, because I have banged on quite a lot about that topic. It's probably the reason for that is it's probably the one I care most about, is making sure people understand what the TOGAF standard is and what it isn't. So it's not a strict formal process that you mindlessly follow in the hopes that something good will happen. It's a collection of material written by enterprise architects for enterprise architects to help you solve the problems that you're going to encounter in your work as an enterprise architect. So think of it that way. It's a really good reference work. It is not a magic recipe of infinite, goodness, infinite wishes. It's not going to, just starting in A and finishing in H. It's not going to help you. You've got to actually exercise your intelligence. So how does that play out? Well, I got 4 scenarios here. I'm not going to do them all, because that would take too long. I'm really going to zoom in on this one to emphasize the point I was making about not mindlessly following the ADM. In this example, what have I got? What have I called it? Joining things up. As organizations grow, they often develop disparate processes and systems that do not communicate and integrate well with one another. All right, so this one, This scenario here has got a deliberate kind of IT-centric bias. That doesn't mean that the TOGAF standard is an IT-centric thing. I mean, it started off as one, unashamedly. There's no hiding that. There's no apology for it. Probably 90% of the people here on this call started out in IT and have moved into enterprise architecture. It's just the way of the world. We hear a lot of people say, but no, we've got a business architecture first and all that kind of stuff. Yes, of course. No one's arguing that business architecture isn't important. It's where we want to go. But that doesn't mean that we have to apologize for coming from an IT department. But this example that I've picked up has an IT-centric bias, and I've got others. The other three probably don't. But the reason I picked up on this one is simply to say, looky here. How do we navigate the ADM in these circumstances? If you wanted to use it as a recipe book, if you wanted to actually try and instantiate it from a sort of method and process perspective, well, yeah, you're going to start by understanding the problem space and understanding the materials that you've got to work with, the resources that you've got to work with. And that's what bullet one there is telling you to do. Look at the resources at your disposal, both in terms of people and materials and money and objectives and constraints and yada, yada, yada. And look at the problem space that you're trying to solve. And you're always going to start with that. If you're not starting a job with understanding what your resources at your disposal and what problem you've been trying to solve, then I don't know what to say to you other than you're probably in the wrong game. But it doesn't really matter whether that's enterprise architecture or you're a carpenter. If you're not doing that, then what are you doing? You're just running around trying to look like you're busy. So you're always going to start with that. So come to peace with it. That's just common sense. The issue then is where do we start? What do we do with these things called business architecture and information systems architecture and technology architecture? Well, I'm saying I would, in this instance, I'd go looking first to find out what the technology landscape is that the organization is so, antsy about in terms of not being joined up enough or whatever. What is the landscape? And then how does it serve the business? And what's the relationship that we've got with products and technology? What's the vendor landscape like? How much is it all costing us? And then I try and figure out how to smooth all that stuff out. Now, that's a really simplified, it's a laughably simplistic explanation of it. But nevertheless, what I'm trying to say here is I haven't started at phase A and gone to phase B. I've started at phase A and then I've looked for techniques and guidance that are going to help me tackle the information systems landscape, because that is the primary problem space in my imaginary scenario, right? I'm having to be massively simplistic to try and boil it down into the available time, which I'm already running out of. But rather than attempt to give you a deep seminar on the rights and wrong ways of navigating the ADM in a given context, what I'm trying to say to you is your context is the context that matters, and the problem that you're trying to solve is the one that matters. And what the ADM is going to give you are some reference materials, but it's not going to tell you that if you feel that you need to start at phase C, it's not going to say, no, don't do that, start phase B. Every time, regardless of the problem you were trying to solve. Always start with business architecture. And if you don't, you're doing it wrong. Who are we to tell you that? Who's anybody to tell you where you should start? You should be smart enough to figure that out on your own. Anyway, there's another example. There's another example. There's another example. I'm not going to talk about it because we're getting short on time. Anyway, I've had a bit of a ramble through this slide. I hope you forgive me. I hope you found it helpful and reasonably informative. If you want to know more, if you want to know how to contribute to the TOGAF standard, how to make it better, how to write new things for it, the easiest way is to become a member. But if you find something in the TOGAF standard that you think is wrong, imagine that, whether that's a spelling mistake or a fundamental concept that's been misrepresented, anyone can do that, okay? And all you need to do is pick up the digital edition visit opengroup.org and you'll find it somewhere. It's probably opengroup.org/TOGAF. You'd think I'd know. I can't remember. And you'll find that little beetle-looking symbol. Desperately trying to avoid doing a John Lennon joke. Couldn't manage it, sorry. But there's that little symbol there. You click on that and you can give your feedback, and anyone can do that. And I promise you that if you do that, the feedback that you provide will be looked at. And in the fullness of time, not too frequently, because, you know, I love agile development and everything, and I genuinely big fan. Done it a lot over the years, but with standards, you can't be changing them every 5 minutes. And I hope you understand that. But within a reasonable cadence, that feedback that you provide will find its way into the view of the members of the architecture forum in the open group, and can lead to change if sufficient people agree with you, if there's sufficient consensus around that. And by and large, reasonable suggestions get reasonable responses and find their way into the standard. So that's a very easy way that people can make a contribution. Even better, become a member, but there's a slightly higher hurdle to jump, and a time commitment that's associated with that. Takeaways. The TOGAF standard is a flexible framework and not a prescriptive process. Hopefully, I've made that point, and I've landed that sufficiently with sufficient emphasis during the course of this little talk. There's a collection. There's kind of an aggregate of wisdom that's contained. All right, wisdom and experience within the TOGAF standard. Whether you like it or you don't. That's true. It's there. It represents the experience of lots of people, but it's not there as a substitute for your own intelligence. You have to apply that when you're choosing which parts of the TOGAF standard to adopt. Do avoid the classic trap or the anti-pattern of trying to do all of it, or assuming that you've got to do all of it, or assuming that you've got to do all of it in sequence. That's like the worst, is when people say, "Oh, you start here and you've got to do all of it until you get to there." No, if you run into anyone who tells you that that's what you're supposed to do, you can be confident that they are wrong. But it is a great tool, I think, for standardizing your approach to enterprise architecture. We're not talking about this in the context of a single person doing enterprise architecture. Really, the value comes when you're trying to get lots of people to work and talk and communicate in the same way. And then it's a really helpful tool for speeding things up. I talked about that early on, desperately trying to resist temptation to bang that drum again. So I'm going to wrap it up because my 30-minute talk took 47. That's quite good for me. If there's anyone watching who actually knows me, they'll know that I speak the truth. So I'm going to say, I hope I've provided some value. Hopefully you got something out of it. Hopefully my sort of main messages have landed. And hopefully I've helped you a little bit to navigate your journey through the TOGAF standard a little more easily. And so thank you very much.